Hello, for this video we're going to show how to simplify using the conjugate. Now let's start with something that doesn't require the conjugate. So this right here, this radical here, this violates rule number 2, which says we can't have a fraction under the radical. So the way we fix that is we rewrite it as the square root of 6 divided by the square root of 5. So we take that division and write it as two separate square roots. Now this then violates rule number 3, which says we can't have any radicals or irrational numbers in the denominator. And the best way to fix that is to square it, which is to really times it by itself. So we're going to multiply by square root of 5 over square root of 5, which in the top will give us a square root of 30. Let's change that. And in the bottom we get the square root of 25, which we know is just going to give us 5. And this ends up being the simplified answer. We cannot reduce the 30 and the 5. Some people will try to do that. Because this isn't really 30, it's the square root of 30, which is somewhere between 5 and 6, so it's 5 point something. So we can't simplify an irrational and irrational component. So this is the fully simplified form. Now over here on this one, you can see we have a binomial on the bottom. One of these terms actually has a square root in it. But if we try to simplify this by multiplying by the square root of 3 over square root of 3, what ends up happening is, when we distribute on the bottom, we get a 5 square root of 3 plus, and of course the square root of 3 times square root of 3 is just 3. And the numerator is just going to be 7 times the square root of 3. But you can see on the bottom, all we did was put that square root of 3 over here on the left-hand side, so it doesn't really fix the issue. So in order to cancel out this radical when it's part of a binomial, we have to use something called the conjugate. Okay, so there was a pattern we learned with special multiplication cases that look like this: a plus b times a minus b, and these are actually called conjugates, where you negate the second one here with the opposite sign. And if you do that old FOIL technique here, we multiply these out, we get a squared, and then we multiply here, we get minus ab, then we multiply in the middle, we get plus ab, then we multiply in the outer ones, we get minus b squared. When we do that, we see that the middle terms end up canceling each other out, leaving the first and last terms to be perfect squares, which is basically two terms which we have right here. So if I could square this and this at the same time, then I won't have a radical in either location. As you can see here, we have the first and the last, which is a squared minus b squared, a binomial that's got two perfect squares here. So let's rewrite this and call it 7 over 5 plus square root of 3. And what we're going to do is multiply by the conjugate of this value, this binomial, which is not 5 plus, but 5 minus the square root of 3. Just don't forget we have to multiply the numerator by the equivalent amount to keep the fraction equivalent to what it was in the beginning. Now let's just go ahead and distribute the top one here. So 7 times 5 is going to give us the 35. And the 7 times the negative 1 square root of 3 is going to give us negative 7 square root of 3. Now the bottom number here, this is going to come from the multiplication of this conjugate. We don't have to do the full factoring or the full foiling like we did over here. We know that this answer is going to be the first number squared, which is 5. So 5 squared. And the second number squared, which is square root of 3 squared, and a subtraction between the two of them. So now when you reduce this or simplify this, you end up with a 25 here minus, and the square root of 3 squared is just going to give you a 3. So the entire denominator is just 25 minus 3, which is going to give you a 22. So the full simplified form of this expression then would be the top number we have here, which is 35 minus 7 square root of 3 over, now we had a 25 minus 3, which is 22. Now if by chance this number, and this number also had something in common, you could factor it out and reduce the entire fraction. But this is the fully simplified form.